Hey everybody, Justin here. I'm excited for a podcast specifically on holding costs. And the title of this podcast is Your Front End Gross May Not Be As High as You Think or as much as you think. And, doing 20 groups all over the country and working with dealers all the time over the last decade or more, holding costs is an interesting thing. And we want to unpack it. So I wanted to make a special episode, especially for the independents, but it's super relevant to the franchise dealers as well, on what holding cost is, how it's defined by different institutions or organizations, and what it practically means to your dealership. Like, what's the importance of knowing it? And then what's the practical application? So let's start with what holding cost actually is. Now, holding cost is one of these words, or sometimes referred to as carrying cost. Holding costs are interesting because if I ask 10 people that are maybe industry experts how they define or calculate holding costs, you might get a few different answers. So there's not really a standardized formula or a standardized industry accepted definition of holding cost. In fact, NADA doesn't publish publicly anyway that I've been able to research and found, and I looked, where they specifically define holding costs as part of an index or part of a glossary of terms. And I found that to be interesting. But what's the point of holding costs? What is it? Well, holding cost is evaluating the cost of holding inventory, but not by the cost of the car. So we're not using the actual cost of the car, ACV, or some other value that you've entered into inventory of the cost of the car. Some people might say cost of good. It's not evaluating the holding cost or the carry cost based on the vehicle's value or what you own it for. Holding cost is using fixed expenses or overhead expenses plus your floor plan to divide down by your inventory to figure out what your overhead erosion is. What is the cost to carry a car based on your expenses? So that's very different than looking at it from a formula, for example, that would be specific to how much you own the car for. So that's what holding cost is in a nutshell. And this was, from the research I've done, it was originally something that became popularized by NCM and Associates. And also there's been some variations from vAuto and specifically some commentary by Dale Pollock on it that we're going to unpack in this episode to look at the variances between NCM, NADA, Dale Pollock, and or vAuto or Cox, as well as what we do in our 20 groups at ARC and how, in my practical experience doing operational consulting all over the country with dealers, how I feel that holding costs is actually relevant to growing a profitable organization. And more importantly, maybe just not going bankrupt, because holding costs has a lot to do with gross margin, but it also has a lot to do with frozen capital and your investment, your ROI. We're going to unpack all that. So first, let me create a baseline, if you will, and I'm going to start with my model, and then we'll look at the different variances that you may be interested in knowing. So my model and the baseline for the holding cost formula starts with what is not included in the holding cost formula for fixed expenses, or better to say overhead expenses. So what's not included? Because it's easier to talk about what's not included than what is included. Essentially, everything on your profit and loss statement in the expense section would be expenses that you have to pay regardless of whether you sell a car or not. But there are, and I talk about 4 expenses that you don't pay until you sell a car. So if we're talking about how much money it costs to hold a car in inventory, then we don't want to use the expenses that are only triggered or executed when a car is sold. And from my perspective, there are 4. One of those is your sales commission. So you don't pay sales commissions until a car is sold. Another one would be F&I commission. You don't sell F&I product until a car is sold. Another one would be a part of delivery expense. Now, delivery expense certainly can have expenses that are applied to every vehicle prior to the sale, but there are also delivery expenses that many dealers categorize that don't happen to a vehicle until it's sold. A case in point would be a delivery prep detail. You can't do a delivery prep detail pay the money and incur the expense to pay that detailer, chemicals, so on and so forth, until a vehicle is actually sold. This one's negligible. It's a very small amount of money. I don't know that it's that big of a deal in general, but it is. Delivery prep would be an example of a delivery expense that isn't incurred until a vehicle is actually sold. The last one is policy. Policy, or some dealers call it goodwill. This is another expense that can't happen until a car is sold. So best practice, a vehicle is sold. Hopefully you did a WEO if you owe the customer something. A lot of times that doesn't happen. If you do a WEO, a lot of times the variable department, the vehicle sales department, is not going to parts to look up what the part cost, to look up the labor times to see what the labor would cost, so that they can actually put an exact or even a range of what the cost would be for that WEO. That would be better, because then it could impact front end gross before the deal is booked and closed. But many times it's just like, we owe you a windshield, and there's no application to cost. So outside that, once the vehicle is sold, though, nonetheless, regardless of the WEO, if you haven't categorized it in gross or deducted gross from it during the sale, a lot of times what happens is customers will come back. Maybe they come back a day later, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month. They come back later and they say, hey, ABC Motors, you sold me this car and the alternator's out, or I got a rear window actuator that's not working. And what do? We want 5-star reviews on Google. We don't want to aggravate every single customer that comes in and buys a vehicle from us. Certainly we have policies that we could show the customer, but it's been my practical experience that often dealers, to avoid negative reviews and try to keep a good reputation on a clean and honest operation, will go ahead and repair the complaining service item on the vehicle to the new customer at no cost or at a reduced cost. This triggers policy or goodwill. Service that the sales department, not the service department, service that the sales department is giving away and eating an expense, but that can only occur after a vehicle is sold. So you've got sales commission, F&I commission, some delivery expenses, as well as policy and goodwill. Those are the 4 expenses that, in my mind, are not used in the holding cost formula, because they only occur when a car sells. Now, let me give a couple of other honorable mentions that I could definitely see an argument. I could be persuaded that they may want to be added into the category of expenses that you would not use in a holding cost calculation. One would be things like a sales manager's commission or a general sales manager's commission. These managers, a desking manager, may be paid commission on the front end. Arguably anybody in the dealership paid on the front end. There could be an argument that that's like sales or like F&I, and those don't occur until a sale is made. The problem with it is it's so inconsistent in the industry that it's very difficult to take 100 dealers and create a formula that may make sense, because these pay plans can be so complicated. But we know for certain, in general speaking, or speaking in general terms, that the sales commissions and the F&I commissions are only triggered and executed when a vehicle is sold. So those are the 4 things we remove from your expenses when calculating holding cost. Now, what's included? Everything else you pay for, whether you sell a car or not. Think about it. If you were to pull up your QuickBooks or your mid-level accounting program right now and say, hey, I'm going to test this theory out. Let me pull up my profit and loss statement from last month. And you go to the expense page, you're going to see things like rent, utilities, telephone, printers, office supplies. Well, if you think about advertising, an interesting one, we'll touch that here in a little bit, but these are all expenses that you have to pay whether you sell a car or not. You have to pay most of your payroll, your workman's comp. If you're doing any benefits for personnel, you have to pay the title clerk regardless if you sell a car or not. You have to pay the controller regardless if you sell a car or not. So inside your P&L, most independents and many franchises will break down the expenses into 4 categories. You've got variable or direct expense. You've got semi-operational expenses, fixed expenses, and personnel. Almost all of those categories, except the 4 I've baselined, would be included and totaled up for an entire month to give you a number of operational expenses minus the 4 that I've outlined, And that will give you one number for the month that you're going to use as your holding cost calculation in the formula. So if that's my baseline, let's look at some others, because, maybe you're like, well, Justin, that's great, but what are other industry standards on holding cost? If you look at NADA, I've done a lot of research on NADA. Unfortunately, I don't have a login to the back end of all of the published materials that are behind a lock-in key through some type of login credential or subscription. But just open web public facing, I haven't been able to find a concrete NADA holding cost formula. However, through articles and from what I know about NADA, they would subscribe very closely to what I've outlined in my baseline. There aren't a lot of variances or differences published between how NADA would look at a holding cost and my baseline that I just rolled out. So now let's talk about NCM. NCM and Associates, great operation, great organization. Love NCM. They're my neighbors. They're up in Kansas City. Know some great people over there. Now, their holding cost calculation, by the way, they were the ones that, as far as my research, popularized holding cost a long time ago. NCM would hold to my baseline holding cost formula with one variant. Now, NCM is going to remove those 4 categories that we already spoke of, but NCM is going to take your total operational expenses, which we just went over, and then they're going to calculate interest and floor plan separately and add it to where I fold it in. Now, what's the difference? Well, the difference is basically how many days out of the year you're calculating. So in my model, I divide by 30 days on average, which I think NADA would attest to. On NCM's model, they do too. They're going to take total operational expenses, divide by 30 days, 30 working days, or 30 days in a month, which would be an average. And then they would move the calculation from there, where NCM would say total operational expenses, but we're going to take floor plan expense, interest and fees. We're going to pull that one out separate, just that one out separate, put it over here on the shelf, run the same calculation with the remaining total operational expenses divided by 30. But then they're going to take this interest floor plan on the vehicles, this interest floor plan and fees, and they're going to divide it by 365 days in the year. And then they're going to add that number to the total operational expenses divided by 30. So all they're doing is pulling out the interest floor plan, putting it over to the side. They're not going to throw it away. They're going to divide it by 365 and then add it to the total operational expense part of the formula. So if you're a math buff out there, which I'm not, think formula inside parentheses plus formula inside parentheses. You're going to do those 2 calculations separately. Total operational expenses divided by 30. And then over here on the side, interest and floor plan expenses divided by 365. And then you're going to add them together. And that's going to give you a little bit of a different result, but it's negligible. It's not that much of a different result because 30 days on average over 12 months is not that much than 365 days out of the year. Now let's jump to a different model. Cox Automotive, vAuto, Dale Pollock. We've had Dale Pollock come and actually speak at ARC 20 groups in the past, especially on the, what I will call the evaporation side of the velocity model, as they and that organization has moved into a new model with some of their new software, kind of getting away from velocity in a way. Got some very interesting podcasts on the velocity model in general, but that's for a different episode. Cox is a little different. So vAuto would calculate holding cost with a few other variations. One, they remove advertising altogether. So advertising is not even in your total monthly expenses. So they take it out, throw it away. They put it over with things like sales commissions, F&I commissions, delivery expense, and policy. So they've added a 5th expense over there that they're just not using in the formula. So there's no advertising expense. And the other main difference between my model and vAuto's model is not only that, but they're using an average of selling days instead of an average of days in the month. So for example, I use an average day of 30 days in the month. This is also in strong alignment with NADA, whereas vAuto is going to calculate it based on selling days. So this would be approximately 24 to 26 days out of the month where the operation is open for business and can actually sell. So vAuto, by taking out the advertising and by reducing the number of days they're dividing by, this is going to cause a higher holding cost number. Your holding cost number, the formula will result in a higher holding cost number per day per unit than something like my baseline model or NADA's. Now, not saying that's right or wrong, but here's the drill. You have to pay those expenses the days you're closed as well. You know, your operation's closed. That's great. It's not timeout. You're still getting charged interest. You're still on all the inventory. You're still having to pay fees on your inventory. You still got to pay the title clerk. You still got to pay all these people that are employed. Their payroll's not going to take a timeout. So all the telephone bill, the printer bill, none of these things get a timeout because it's Sunday. So that's why I don't agree with taking advertising out well, advertising is kind of a different subject, but that's why I don't agree with using the 24 to 26 selling days on the advertising point. Don't agree with that either. You've got to pay advertising to sell cars, not once cars are sold. So in order for me to sell cars, I would strongly think that you have to spend some money in marketing to do that. Now, it is usually classified as variable expense. So is interest and floor plans often. Variable being things that you can adjust, things that you can change, things that you can scale as your volume scales up or down. But you still have to pay advertising. You have to have an advertising budget in order to sell cars. If I opened up a lot tomorrow and I put 30 cars on the lot, or I put 100 cars on the lot, I've got to invest in marketing in order to get leads so that I can sell those cars. That's the argument that I have of why you want to have advertising in the formula so you can get a more accurate holding cost per day. Okay, so this is the fun part. So now we kind of got the math, total monthly expenses, divided by your inventory units counts, how many units you have in inventory. That's going to give you your monthly holding cost per unit. Now we're going to divide that by 30. Now you got your daily holding cost per unit. But where does the rubber meet the road? How does this information, let's say it's $37. You know your holding cost is $37. You drive into the lot every morning, you look at the sea of metal, and you think about each one of these cars being a big block of ice, as my friend Todd Hunt, Jerry Hunt Supercenter would say. They're just melting away. Every day they're melting away. Or think of them as just big stacks of $100 bills. And when you're driving in the lot, the wind blows and every single stack of $100 bills is blowing in the wind. That's your holding cost. The longer you hold the car, the more operational expenses that you're spending to sit on it, right? So now that we know that, and we know the formula, how do we make it practical? What's your real gross profit, not your blind gross profit? And this is where it really, really gets exciting, because if you know what your holding costs are, the next thing we need to know is what your average front end gross is. Now, this is another subject that we'll look at some differences here in a minute on different associations that calculate front end gross differently on the holding cost formula. But let's assume you know what your average front end gross, and I define front end gross as what you sold the car for minus what you own it for, which would include recon, plus your admin fee, plus any aftermarket sale average, plus any preloads, but excluding soft packs and hard packs. And I know that's a little bit to digest there, but essentially it's your front end gross minus any hard pack or soft pack that you might have, including admin fees. Now, let's say that your average front end gross with all those ads is $1,500. And you're like, wow, I got $1,500 gross. That's actually, it's not great, but let's just assume you thought it was great. And we now know that number. And so now we need to look at one more number, and we need to look at how many days on average do you hold a car? How long on average does your store keep a car in stock before it sells? And let's say you hold a car on average for 45 days. So we know we're going to make $1,500 on average. We know our average holding cost per day is $37. And we know we're going to hold that car for 45 days. When I add the $37 per day times 45 days, I'm going to get a number. Let's say it's $1,350. So I'm going to take my front end gross of $1,500. I'm going to subtract the $1,350 in holding cost, and I'm going to net $150. That's going to be my gross profit. And A lot of people, a lot of dealers I've worked with look at that and they scratch their head and they think that can't be real. That can't be real. I'm going to end up with $150. Yes. No, actually, no, you're right. I'm wrong. You're not going to end up with $150. Why? Because we still haven't paid sales commission and we still haven't paid the sales manager's commissions. F&I, we get a pass because they're going to hopefully clear their own path. We haven't paid delivery prep, and God forbid we have policy because that would be added on too. So now you have to take those four expenses that we categorized over here on the side, and we have to remember them and bring them back in and say, wait a minute, now we have to take the result of this formula of front end gross minus front end gross, the holding cost multiplied times the average amount of days that you hold a car, get that difference figure, and don't get excited yet. Hopefully it's not negative already, because now you got to add in these other expenses that we haven't paid yet until we sell a car. So that is what I would say, turning in holding cost into the story of what is real gross versus what is blind gross. Okay, so let's back up one more step and look at depreciation, something we often do not talk about when we're talking about holding cost. And some dealers get confused. According to research I did on CBT News, some of the framing that NCM does on depreciation, they would have two camps, if you will, of depreciation. Number one camp of depreciation would be market erosion. So these are things that the value of the car is depreciating over time on your lot, sometimes very rapidly. That is one form of depreciation, would be market erosion. And the next one would be not market erosion, but would be holding costs, carrying costs, overhead erosion. So exactly what the topic of this podcast is. So you have these two camps. You have depreciation of the vehicle or market erosion, but then you also have overhead erosion. And most dealers understand number one really well. You understand market erosion. You book a car out today, it doesn't sell. You book it out 7 days from now, and somehow that vehicle has depreciated like crazy. We all know about that. But there's also overhead holding cost or overhead erosion, and dealers aren't as familiar with how that impacts profitability. So you may say, well, where's the depreciation for market erosion in this formula? And good question. It's not there. We don't include, and I don't recommend including market erosion or depreciation of vehicles in holding cost. And let me tell you why. That's usually reflected in the gross profit, right? So as you're trying to sell a car, it's a very price-driven market. As you're pricing cars to market, in order for you to be able to sell and retail that vehicle, you probably have some form of an aging inventory strategy, a reduction in price strategy to sell these vehicles. And so as you reduce the price, what are you doing? You're keeping up with market. You're reducing the price of the car to keep up with the market. You're taking the depreciation, which results in what? It results in a lower gross profit. So I believe you are actually taking into account the depreciation of vehicles based on your average front end gross profit. So if you could sell every single vehicle in 30 days or less, best practice from guides like NADA, NCM would be sell 60 to 70% of your inventory in the first 30 days. I bet you your gross profit would be much higher than a dealer that's average selling day is day 90, right? Because he's got to reduce his prices over 90 days in order to turn that vehicle. It's not turning. Nobody's looking at it. No VDPs, no interest. What do I got to do? I got to cut the price. And then on day 90, somebody bumps their head and buys the car, but I've had to reduce my price to get there. And so we're taking that depreciation off the front end gross before we ever sell the car. So that's why I don't believe there's any reason to put market erosion or depreciation in the holding cost formula. But that would not have anything to do with the operational erosion, the holding cost expense erosion that we are putting in. But if you look at the differences between NADA and vAuto's benchmark daily holding costs, NADA roughly $40, vAuto roughly $85. I don't know this for a fact, but it could signal that perhaps vAuto is using market erosion inside their holding cost formula. I don't know the answer to that. I don't want to testify to that. I'd be curious if anybody knows the answer to that question. You could put put the comment. If you do know, we'd love to hear you put that down in the comments below. I will say, however, this makes a great argument for you to track, and this is why we do this in 20 groups, your front end gross by buckets of ages. So if you look at your front end gross 0 to 15 days, look at your sales 16 to 30 days, look at your sales 31 to 45 days, on and on, 60 days, 75 days, 90 days. Look at the average front end gross profit you have in those buckets. And I would be shocked if you don't see some correlation between a declining front end gross with age. And I think that's, again, another argument not to include it in the holding cost formula, but you can check it and I think it's a great exercise for you just to, check your six every quarter or every 6 months and say, let me group all my sales and my front end gross profit averages. Let me group those by buckets, 0 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 to 90, 90 day plus, and watch to see if, is it $2,000 in 30 days down to 1,850 in 30 days down to 1,500 and so on and so on and so on. And this is a great way for me to somewhat double check the math, if you will, using division to check multiplication of why we don't use market erosion in the holding cost formula, but an easy way you could do some quick math to figure out if that's balancing out and reflective of what we're saying. Now, let's just have a quick pack conversation. What about packs and holding costs, and why do I pull them out of front end gross when I'm subtracting front end gross? When I have my front end gross, subtract my holding costs to get my difference figure after I've multiplied my front end gross by average days vehicles are held in stock before I sell them. What about these packs? Well, a soft pack is an easy answer. A soft pack does not increase the cost of a vehicle. There's no journal entry made inside accounting that's adjusting for a soft pack. A soft pack primarily in new car franchise stores. If you're a franchise, you may still use a soft pack. Not a bad idea. We all sell from cost. If you're using a soft pack, though, that's tied to commission. We've already pulled commissions. Soft packs don't really increase the cost of the car. So your calculation there would be not affected by soft pack at all. So soft pack is just completely irrelevant to this conversation of holding cost. But then you get to hard pack. Now, hard pack is very different. I even have a lot of dealers, and hey, there's no shame in this game. A lot of dealers don't understand the difference between a hard pack and a soft pack. What I really think is they don't understand a hard pack. Soft packs are pretty easy to understand. But a hard pack is essentially when you take an expense and you charge it to the car. Now you're making a journal entry on the car and you're literally raising the price of it. So let's say you bought a car for $20,000 and you're going to pack or increase the cost of the car $300 for detail on every single car. Well, you're going to go into accounting, into inventory, and you're going to put that cost, that expense literally on that vehicle. So you now own that vehicle for $20,300, not $20,000. Where's the other side of that transaction? In accounting, there's always got to be two sides to a transaction, so they bounce to zero. And so you've got this expense, but what have you paid? You've paid nothing, right? You haven't paid anything for this pack. It's just sitting there. Now, dealers will handle these packs very many ways. If I had 100 dealers on a line and I said, tell me how you handle hard packs, there'd be 110 answers somehow, right? And that's okay. There's a lot of ways to do it, right? So if you have a hard pack, you have to be careful not to double tap your expenses. So if you've expensed the car for detail, now that pack needs to reduce the expense line of detail. So you've charged it over here. You can't charge it again over in expenses and personnel or on flat rate, or you can't double charge it or you're getting hit for two charges for the same detail. So you would have to then subtract it from that line item. That's one way to handle it. Another way is to move it to a schedule. So you take your $300, you move it to an accounting schedule, and what do you have? You bought 100 cars this month. You have 300 packs. 300 times 100 gives you a total. And then you've got your actual expenses that they're charged against in detail. So maybe you're charging $300 a car, but you're only on your car, you're packing at 300. But your real cost to run detail is $200 per car. So if I've credited against the car 300 times 100 cars, but I'm only actually spending 200 to perform this expense, I've got $100 left over. So that would be a gain on the schedule. It could be inversed, where I charge $300 to every single car, but my expense to actually perform that detail in wages and comp. Now, the inverse is possible too, right? So you could have a gain, but you could also have a loss on the schedule. For example, if you're marking every vehicle, you're packing every vehicle $300 for detail, but it's costing you $400 to perform that detail through various expenses in detail, you've now got a $100 loss on the schedule per detail. And these things are going to affect your gross profit. If I add $300 to the car, it's going to affect my gross profit. So I could bring that negative, that loss or that gain back into the financial statement, but that's what a hard pack is. So dealers, as a best practice, can handle it either way. They can add a pack to the car and then decrease that corresponding expense, or they can move that $300 over to a schedule and then reconcile it against the actual expense to come up with a gain or loss that you'd move back over onto the financial. Now, what does that mean for holding costs? Well, if I've ran it on a schedule and let's say at the end of the month, you've got a $10,000 gain, I would want to now move that back over to my holding cost front end. I would want to move that back over against my holding cost result. So I've just picked up 10 grand. That's good. I can now increase my difference figure between my average selling price and my holding costs. Let's say I ended up with a net $500 after my holding cost, but I picked up another $100 per car in gain. I can now increase that 500 to 600 because I'm picking up money on the hard pack. Now, we don't include hard pack in the holding cost formula because of what I just described. Dealers account for it in different ways, but not only that, dealers have very creative ways to do hard packs, and they're not all apples. It's apples, oranges, and pears, and all kinds of other fruits. And so for example, some people almost use hard packs as a soft pack, but it's literally charged against a car, but there's nothing else reconciling against it, which makes it pure gross profit, right? So I don't want to lose that. So I could bring that back in on my holding costs calculation. So here's part of the case against aging inventory. And I think this is well said. CBT News reported dealer Dan Oakes with this quote, and he puts it plainly. This is what he says. He says, because dealers don't actually write a check out of the business account for holding costs, they don't see what recon delays can cost them. Because you don't write a check for this amount, that's because you just write it to the telephone company and you write it to the printer company. But if you had to write a check, you have a front end gross for $1,500. Great job. High five. 45 days, we made $1,500 gross. Now you need to write a check for $1,350 to pay for all the holding costs. You might look at all this a little differently, but you don't write a check for it. So it becomes somewhat blind, hidden, if you will. It's hard to see. Holding costs, I love this line. Holding cost is invisible on a check register, but very real on a profit and loss statement. That's pretty powerful. Once accumulated holding cost exceeds your gross profit, it's now flipped from an asset to a liability. You're not making money anymore. Now, I want to touch a subject that I've had the most heated debates between dealers and 20 groups, and even including myself, ran scenarios and models in Excel and now using Claude to really have this argument with a dealer in the room that says, yeah, but I own my own inventory, Justin. I own it all. I don't have a loan on my inventory. So I've got room to hold my cars a little longer. I'm not so concerned with holding costs because I don't have a floor plan. What difference does it make, right? Nothing we've talked about yet has anything to do with a loan outside of the one expense that's included in the holding cost formula for floor plan interest and fees. Outside of that, now you're just making an excuse for yourself. Hey, I've done a great job, and you have done a great job. I've paid off my whole inventory. It's hard to find these cars. Buying cars is hard. As Chris Jackson would say, the car business is hard. And so what you're doing is you're creating you're creating an excuse to say, I can be a little bit more patient. I don't owe anything on the car. I'm not getting hit with interest and fees on my vehicles. Yeah, but you're not turning them either, and they're depreciating, and you're eating all this holding cost. There's no reason why not having a floor plan would affect this decision at all. Now, be curious. There's going to be some great probably stones thrown at me on this one. So if you differ from that, and I'm sure we're going to get some comments on that one, please, I'd love to hear your logic. If you could unpack why owning your inventory would negate the idea of not paying attention to your holding cost and how it's being buffered against front end gross profit, and how having a paid off inventory affects that at all. This really quickly turns into a turning inventory conversation, how many turns you're doing per year, which I'm really not trying to go to. I'm just really trying to focus in this episode on how that might impact holding cost. And I can't think of a good reason other than you would have a less holding cost because your interest expense would be excluded because it would be zero. Now, there are certainly dealers that once you've paid off your inventory, you would form a new company that is a floor plan company that you own, where you can now put that interest and expense for floor plan back into the dealership and move that money over to the new company that you own. But that's a little bit, I'd say, more advanced and still not relevant to the holding cost calculation formula. I'm sorry, still not relevant to the holding cost conversation that we're having today. I want you to think about this. I made this note. A price cut today is usually cheaper than a wait. If dropping the price by $300 sells the car 10 days sooner and 10 days of holding costs is $500, the discount is the profitable move. The sticker price gap is an illusion once holding cost is netted in. So this is all math, just like most of the car business. You have to figure out what your average front end gross profit is through these different aging buckets. And there comes a point where dropping the price outruns or is more profitable than it is to hold a car another 8 days, another 10 days, another 15 days, extrapolate the math out. And once you kind of frame that and get that, then look, we're not trying to just go in and gut prices. And I'm not a velocity model fan. By no means, but we do have to drop prices so we can retail these vehicles and not hold on to them to where they're getting too old and turning into frozen capital. And this carry cost erosion is eating all of our front end gross. I want to make one more comment about an honorable mention, if you will, about taking vehicles to the auction. So what I found is a lot of dealers feel like they've got to water on the lot and they got to clean up their inventory, and their natural inclination is to take 10 units to the auction next week, sell them for MMR, we hope, or a little less, and get out of them and free that cash back up and try to go into the market again with something fresh. But, that might be the natural tendency in this whole holding cost conversation, that you're not able to sell the car. You've reduced the price, but here's been my experience. My experience with dealers that do that, the dump at the auction to try to free up cash, it's usually because they haven't had a regimented price cutting system. They still have front end gross held in the car. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a dealer say, I'm going to take some of this 90-day inventory to the auction and dump it, when they're the difference between what they have listen to this, the difference at what they have the car priced on their website is $4,000 more than MMR. Well, you take it to auction, you don't get an admin fee. You're not going to pick up your pack. You're not going to get F&I a chance to swing the bat and save the day. Like, why would you do that? Why not cut the price in half? Well, I can't cut the price in half. That would make me feel terrible. I mean, no, you're about to go get MMR. You're about to lose $4,000 from where you're at right now. Why would you not let this glide slope, this runway approach continue down to MMR? Then you can at least recover back end and F&I. Look, that's a fresh unit to F&I. You think F&I is like, oh, this car's 90 days old, we're not going to make any money. No, your F&I managers, let's go. It's a swing. It's time to make some money. Hey, I want to help the team out. I'm going to go in and, I'm going to try to hit a home run here. And so that's where I do think this idea of wholesaling vehicles does intersect with holding costs, because the longer you hold a car, the more days of holding you have. And so price cutting can circumvent holding a car too long and outrunning those expenses. And also be aware that this doesn't mean take the aged vehicles to the auction. I always like to mention this because, man, it can save you tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars a year just by moving those price cuts down closer to MMR. So to wrap up, to conclude, I want to show you an actual visual that we're going to throw up here on the screen that you can see putting two dealers side by side. Now I'm using an ARC 20 group composite. Highly recommend you're in a 20 group. We talk about this stuff till we kick this horse to death. I mean, if you're not in a 20 group, it's the number one ROI of anything you could be doing for your business. I mean, it's so cheap for, several $100s a month to be able to get around 19 board members, if you will, to conversate about these things and look at your data compared to other dealers. It's a no brainer. So I'm using a sample composite. I want to make sure this is clear. These are not real numbers that we're throwing up on the screen. These are scrambled numbers. So the rows are correct, the labels are the correct, but the benchmarks, the group averages that you may see, the Linus benchmarks you see, our composite's called the Linus report. The ranking line is going to be correct that it's a ranking line, but none of the data or the percentages in here, they're all scrambled. But look at on this particular fixed expense page at the bottom between rows 18 and 25, you'll notice this holding cost and front end gross profit average calculation that we've been talking about this whole episode. Now I want you to look at the dealer sitting in the third and the fourth position. This would be dealer 4 right next to dealer 7. Now, what's interesting about dealer 4 is selling 88 units per month and dealer 7 is selling 90 units per month. That's pretty close. One dealer selling 88, one dealer selling 90. So right out of the gate, it's not like we're talking about apples and oranges here. They're 2 units away from each other. Now look down to line 18 and you'll see that dealer 4 that's selling 88 units per month has a holding cost expense. Now, again, this is using my baseline. We've pulled those 4 expenses out. Everything else is included, of $237,366, while dealer 7 has a holding cost of $242,756. Very close numbers. Their monthly selling expenses are very close together. 88 sales and 90, and we're the difference in holding cost for the month is roughly $5,000 apart. Now you move down to row 19 and you've got number of vehicles in stock. Dealer 4 has 172, dealer 7 has 279, a whole lot more inventory. Now we're about to divide the total expenses per month, selling expenses, by the number of units in inventory. If I divide a very similar number by 172 versus by dividing by 279, I'm going to get 2 very different numbers. And you're going to see that, right? For dealer 4 on line 20, the monthly holding cost per unit inventory is $1,380. Dealer 7's lower, $870, because we're spreading that cost against a whole bunch more inventory. Go to line 21, daily holding costs. Now we're going to just divide this by 30 days. So for dealer 4 on row 21, I get $46 per day. Dealer 7, I get $29 per day. Now, if I go to row 22, what's the approximate age of the inventory when it's sold? So here I'm going to multiply my daily holding cost times the number of days each of these dealers typically hold a car. Dealer 4 holds a car for 39 days. Dealer 7 holds a car for 38 days. So 1 day less. So the cost to hold a car for dealer 4 is $1,796. The cost to hold a car for dealer 7 is $1,130 per car. That's total. Now we bring in the front end gross. With the front end gross, with ads, when I mean with ads, we talked about this earlier in the podcast, we're adding back preloads, aftermarket sales, not ancillary sales and F&I, but things like, you put on some, you upgraded some wheels, or you upgraded, the customer bought running boards. So aftermarket and, your pack, your admin fee, your doc fee, we're going to add those back in. So those are in these numbers. So for line 24, you have front end gross and dealer number 7 with a $2,967 gross. So now all we do is we're going to take line 24 and we're going to subtract it from line 23. We're going to take the average front end gross and we're going to subtract it by the holding cost over the average amount of days that each of these dealers hold a car. So dealer on line 25, you see the net, the difference of doing this. Dealer 4, who sold 88 cars, is losing $1,006 before he's paid sales commission, before delivery expense, before any policy. Dealer 7 is made $1,864 and still has to pay sales commissions, still has to pay delivery expense, still has to pay any policy if it arises. But hey, here's the point. These dealers are 2 cars a month apart, right? And a lot of this is contingent on their front end gross. There's a very big difference between their front end gross, but you can see the difference between how profitable each dealer is based on the average time that they hold cars. So this is just a great way to look at the numbers in the Linus report, so you can see how 2 dealers selling cars very similarly with similar operating expenses come out at the end, that invisible check, with a very different net profit result. And that's the point of what we wanted to show today, that your front end gross may not be as high as you think it is just because you held on to a car for too long and somebody come in and bump their head. So listen, I'm really curious to your comments on holding costs. This is, we can talk about this holding cost conversation for hours inside of a 20 group. So I'm sure there'll be lots of comments. I'm not saying my way's perfect. I'm sure that there's holes in my baseline that maybe you pick up. I'd love to hear those. If you've got a comment about how you and your store are using holding costs or bouncing that off of average days to sell a car, and then looking at the difference figure between your average front and gross, I'd like to hear it. I'd like to hear your arguments. Do you think advertising should be in or out? Do you think hard pack should be in or out of the formula? And what are you using this data to do practically to take it to the next level? So appreciate you guys tuning in to this episode. Hope it was helpful. Please like and subscribe and share this channel. That's how we get the word out to spread different knowledge and education in the industry to make everybody sharper. So have a great day, and we'll see you next time.